Hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you to my channel. Thank you very much for finding me. And if you're new here, I grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia, without any help from greenhouses, grow lights, humidifiers, heat, just me and them inside or outside, or we don't play at all. So if that is your condition and you think this might be of use, do hit subscribe. I post every week narrating my amateur ramblings as I try to figure out what and how I can grow orchids in Melbourne. And here is something, ta-da, which is in flower, which we will talk about today, which clearly is loving Melbourne. And plant lovers, it is the first video of 2024. So happy new year. I hope the weeks that have just gone have been wonderful for you, full of joy and prosperity and peace. Let us just wish for that. But I'm looking forward to this year to see, a few things I'm just going to tighten my technique on and see if I can do a little better with, which is like my primary school report. Matthew could do better if he focused more. And to that end, I've got some books to show you. So just before Christmas, I went to Sydney and there's a massive Japanese bookshop there. And I mean, not just selling Japanese books, it's a Japanese branded bookshop. And it's the only bookshop I have ever seen that actually had A, orchid books, but B, multiple orchid books. I was just in seventh heaven and I bought them, plant lovers. Now I haven't really read anything yet, so I can't tell you if they're any good, but I'm just going to show you. Orchids, a practical guide for gardeners. Now who doesn't need that? And it is written by Brian and Wilma Rittershausen. There you go, Orchids. And there's the authors down there. Quite a lovely book, quite encyclopedic in terms of the species that it's covering and the varieties it's covering. I mean, some of the information I'm sure will be quite basic, but I think there's always things you can find out in books, particularly about the history of a particular plant in cultivation, which is always useful. Second book, because there's three, this one is called Starting Out with Orchids, a humble little book, want to not get reflection, and this is by David L. Jones. And again, might be very beginnery, but I don't really care. But it's kind of like a dictionary of orchids, can you see? With all the different care information. And again, I sometimes find that these very simple books, which just give you very clear instructions, are really useful. And there's actually quite a lot of Australian orchids in this, Australian terrestrial orchids, which I had some success with and then I didn't. So I'll be very keen just to look at some basics. So there we go. Starting Out with Orchids by David L. Jones. Obviously still in print now and available. Oh, and this is the bookshop there that I bought these orchids from. I'll drop the link below so that if you're in Australia, you can find the bookshop. And then the last one is this one, Orchid by Dan. Now that could be Torre or Torre, depends how you want to pronounce it. But this is really interesting because it's kind of like a social history of orchids. So it's orchids in literature and in botanic art and in medicine and all sorts of things. So more of kind of a social history than a how to grow book. But I do find those stories really interesting. So this is Orchid by Dan Torre or Torre, depending how we're going to pronounce that. And I'm looking forward to reading this because it's much more sort of non-fiction rather than, botanical listy. Anyway, let's see. Anyway, plant lovers, it's 2024. Let's get on with the case in point, this orchid. Look at the size of that flower before we go any further. Look how big it is. It is a big flower. All right, let me not keep you in suspense, although I'm sure lots of you know what it is. It is Maxillaria nigrescens. And Maxillaria, Maxillaria tenuifolia, which lots of people try and grow and is tricky. I have never flowered for me. Anyway, healthy plant, never does anything. So I'm always just a bit hesitant. They're supposed to really like my climate. But anyway, this one is loving life. So let's learn all about it from my humble amateur perspective. First of all, I have just spotted a caterpillar. Little evil thing. Oh my goodness. And I do hate killing caterpillars, but I'm sorry, caterpillar, I am going to have to kill you. This is one of the trials of growing orchids outside, is that caterpillars just love them. They love the new leaves and they love buds and flowers, unfortunately. Sorry, caterpillar. So Maxillaria nigrescens is a wonderful member of the Maxillaria family, probably some of the biggest flowers you're ever likely to see from that type of orchid. Absolutely wonderful. And it comes from South America, where all the Maxillarias come from. And its range is basically sort of from Colombia all the way around the west coast and adjoining parts to Bolivia. So quite a wide range of distribution. And it is a high altitude plant, which means generally it likes cold, cooler conditions. And a lot of the Maxillaria come from similar sort of high, moist, misty mountain environments. So if you're in somewhere a little cooler, it's a great orchid group to have a go at. And what I've discovered is that a lot of these mountain orchids, whether they're from Asia or from South America, do really well in Melbourne because we do have bright but cool winters which don't freeze, and often a lot of sort of airborne precipitation, so quite humid as well in those colder months. So kind of a version of their climate. Of course, we can get quite hot, dry summers, so that is the issue with a lot of these sorts of plants, is keeping them cool. But anyway, we're jumping too far. Let's start at the very beginning. It is, plant lovers, surprise, surprise, an epiphyte, which means it kind of lives in the nooks and crannies of branches on trees. Now, some epiphytes are clingers. They cling to the side of the branch for grim death, which is quite a different habit to epiphytes, which are sort of sitting in an enclosure within a tree, or on another mound of other things like ferns and whatever that have accumulated leaf matter, and you'll find orchids in there. So there's lots of different ways that an epiphyte can grow on a tree. This one, though, likes those sort of nooks where matter has built up, so there's a little bit of medium in there and it's got something to get its roots into. Which of course means free draining, because if you imagine that sort of water cycle, you've got rain or mist coming, it will pass through the roots of the plant, run down the rest of the branch of the tree, the trunk of the tree, so the plant absorbs it as quickly as it can and then waits until it happens again. But as this is from a fairly consistently moist climate, it is one of those epiphytes that does not want to dry out. Now, it does need to get slightly less wet and less moisture in winter, but not a plant. In fact, I don't think any of the Maxillarias want to dry out particularly much at all. And so to help that, to help the whole free draining thing, you need a free draining medium that is a little moisture retaining though. So this one, we'll get to the potting in a minute and the whys and the wherefores, but with my Maxillaria, I tend to use medium to small bark with perlite with sphagnum moss, just to retain moisture but allow it to drain quite freely. And then, of course, as I said, just in winter, don't water it as much, but in summer, you'll need to water it probably every day if you're in a warm climate like mine, or every couple of days if you're in a slightly cooler condition. So really, thus far, no dissimilar to many other orchid types. Oncidiums, for example, or Miltoniopsis, you'd probably use similar sort of potting medium for those as you would for this. Now this one though, look at the size of these pseudobulbs. They are massive. Now the other Maxillaria, I've got much, much smaller forms to plant, and look, that's kind of a good, what is that? It's like 1.5 feet, the length of that leaf. It's a good sort of 60 centimeters. Anyway, so quite a large plant. The other Maxillarias I have are much, much smaller. And I did sort of go near this with trepidation. But, and again, and I'm sorry to bang on about this, but I went to an orchid sale as part of an orchid group, and I met the grower. And this is the thing that just so helps. If you're undecided or not sure if something could grow in your area or how you could grow it, meeting someone in your same area that grows the orchid who can tell you how they grow it successfully is gold dust. So the grower of this was selling it, and it's her division, and told me exactly what she does with all of her Maxillaria, which I did mention before when I think I did an orchid haul video when I bought this one, and I did talk to her about my Maxillaria tenuifolia because it's just annoying me, and she said, oh yeah, it's difficult. Sometimes it flowers, sometimes it won't. It might flower for years and then stop and then start again. What she said, which is kind of consistent, I think, for all of the ones that I'm growing here, is they like to be bright, but cool and moist. So we've done the moist. The bright thing, bright indirect light, but no direct sunlight. So if you imagine they come from very moist forests, which are either deciduous or semi-deciduous, but lots of mist and fog. And that actually does act like shade cloth. It does act as a filtration for UV, for light coming through. So although they might be in sort of a brighter environment, there's a lot of cloud cover protecting them, and of course the leaves of the trees. So basically, bright indirect light, no direct sunlight, and you should be okay. And honestly, I just hadn't kept my eye on this and was really surprised by the flower spike. And also, I didn't realize how big the flower was going to be. So as it just kept growing, I was completely amazed. So let's talk about the flower. Oh, and the fragrance. But first of all, Maxillaria nigrescens. Now, Maxillaria, as you might imagine, Maxillaria refers to jaw. Someone thought it looked like the jaw of an animal. And nigrescens means sort of blackish because part of the labellum on some of them, well, on this one, is supposed to be a little blackish. Anyway, looks much more sort of brown to me. But anyway, I didn't name it. But the thing is, the size of the flower, look at that. It is just enormous. The other thing is the fragrance. Now, I wish you could smell it. It's spicy and it's chocolatey, but it's not sweet. It's really rich. It's like if you're talking about sort of fragrance and perfume, it's like an oriental spice, you know, it's quite rich and layered, not light and fluffy, but it's got some body to it. It's a delicious fragrance, and it is quite filling the room. The minute you walk in, you can smell it. Not overpoweringly so, but it's a scent that makes itself felt. Gorgeous. Now, should you get to the lucky point of multiple flowers, it will really be divine. Now, we alluded to potting. We alluded to the fact I bought this in a black plastic pot and I bought it in winter. Now, not a time to repot things, depending on the orchid, but in a climate like mine. So in winter, this plant's not really doing anything. It's just sort of in stasis. In spring, summer, it's going to start to flower and produce new growths. And that is when its roots are going to be active and a good time to repot. So I will be repotting this when the flower has finished doing its flowery thing. Because as you can see, I have got so much new growth on this, it's almost obscene. There is this quite large growth here, but there's 3 in here, there's 1 here. There's little nibs everywhere of new growth. So I am looking forward to this being quite a chunky plant before too long. However, Maxillaria don't respond that well to repotting in division, so they can sulk. Now, I'm not going to divide it. I'm just going to try and, without too much intervention, slip it into a new pot with a small medium bark, perlite and sphagnum mix, but try not to disturb the roots or the plant too much. I'm certainly not dividing it. So we'll see. But yeah, a plant that likes to build up its bulk naturally and not a plant that you want to really divide. You can, of course, because this is a division, but it will sulk, like the best of us. So my flowers are all sort of shades of ochre, orange and mahogany, I think. Absolutely beautiful. They come from a mature, let me take out the tag and you can see better. The flower comes from last year's mature pseudobulb, or in fact any mature pseudobulb, I think. And then the name of the game will of course be to get these growths to mature and then they can flower. And I'm just looking and I can't see any cut flower spikes. So I'm wondering if these other bulbs have ever flowered, which means perhaps they could. Who knows? Anyway, that is the flowering cycle. Now I am recording this in December in Australia, which is sort of midsummer. And this plant can bloom any time between spring, summer, end of summer, early autumn. So there we are. It is kind of doing what it's doing, but that also suggests perhaps that if it's happy, it might decide to bloom from other bulbs during the year. Who knows? Now, we've done watering, we've done light, we've done temperature. Food, like all of us, we need to eat. And like all of my orchids, spring topical application of a slow-release pellet fertilizer. And then really in winter, nothing. Dial down the watering and no fertilizing whatsoever because this plant isn't really doing anything. Late spring, it's going to start ramping up, and that is when I would start watering it more and then just adding a slight bit of something to the water. So either a tonic like a seaweed-based solution or a worm juice in dilution. And then as the season gets a bit warmer, crank into the more full-on fertilizers, which I always use a liquid-based one, which you dilute again, sort of 1/8, 1/10 the recommendation on the bottle. And I use a mix. I use things that are specifically designated for orchids, other things that are just generic food, and other things that are for all flowering plants. So I mix it up because there's going to be a mix of nutrients and things that the plant wants in all of those different fertilizers. I don't go down the rabbit hole of chemical analysis or actually pH either, so forgive me, not my bag. Anyway, I am pleased to say that this plant looks particularly healthy. They're quite leathery, tough leaves actually, which does sort of surprise me, given that it comes from that sort of cooler, more temperate area. You imagine the leaves to be a bit softer, but they're not. It's actually really quite tough, which would suggest it could take a bit of drought, but I'm not going to run that risk anyway. I'm really thrilled that it's going gangbusters with the new growths, and I really hope that when I repot it, I'm not going to set it back anyway. We'll have to see if it blooms next year to cover that base. And so plant lovers, there we are, Maxillaria nigrescens, and just saying it once again, I probably would not have bought this plant unless I had met the grower who is in my city in similar conditions to me, who told me about it. Because, you know, you see so many different orchids online or in catalogues or wherever you might see them, and just narrowing the field in terms of what can actually grow for you is really tricky. So I was thrilled to meet someone who could tell me exactly what to grow. Well, there we are. I hope you've loved our little journey into Maxillaria. If my tenuifolia ever flowers, believe me, I will make a film about that and go running down the street screaming, because it's been a while, but it's now in exactly the same spot as this, and the grower I bought this from grows her tenuifolia in exactly the same spot, same conditions. So if this one can flower and prosper, the other one should as well. But plant lovers, here we are, 2024. I hope this year brings with it all manner of wondrousness, joy, prosperity, and orchid health and happiness. And I look forward to seeing you wherever you may be next week for my continuing rambling adventure. So until then, take care.